Step 3. The timeline extension. When the recovery goal is driving your decisions, it's because your brain has decided that tonight is when the recovery needs to happen. Extend the timeline. The recovery doesn't happen tonight. It happens across hundreds of future sessions if you make correct decisions. This hand is in that specific middle range where you can construct an argument for playing it and an argument for folding it, and both arguments sound reasonable because you're good enough at this game to build a case for whatever you want to do. The pot is already involved. The stacks are relevant. And somewhere in the back of your processing, underneath the range work and the board texture reading, there's a different kind of calculation running. You're stuck. This pot could get you unstuck. Not all the way, nothing gets you all the way in one hand, but it could move the number. It could make the session feel less like what it currently feels like. You play the hand, not because the analysis said to, because something else said to. And that something else is what this video is about. Not the play, not whether it was technically justified, the something else. The mechanism running in the background of your decision-making when you're losing, that has nothing to do with ranges or equity or board texture and everything to do with what it feels like to be stuck at a poker table with real money at risk and a self-concept that's taking damage alongside the bankroll. Most conversations about chasing losses treat it as a discipline failure. You should know better. You do know better. You chase anyway. The conclusion usually drawn is that discipline needs to improve, that emotional control needs to improve, that you need to leave the table sooner or not let results affect your play. All of that is true and none of it is sufficient. Because the behavior isn't irrational in the way that analysis assumes. It's following a very specific logic, a logic built not from poker strategy, but from how the human brain processes loss, threat, and the desperate need to restore something that has been taken. That logic is coherent. It's just pointed in the wrong direction. Let's open it up and look at what's actually inside. When you're stuck, the game you're playing is not the same game you were playing when you sat down. Same cards, same table, same opponents, different game. The goal has changed, and when the goal changes, the way every decision feels changes with it. At the start of the session, the goal was accumulating chips, maximizing expected value across the full run of hands you'd be dealt. Standard poker. But at some point, and the transition is subtle enough that you often don't notice it happening, the goal became something else. Recovering the loss. These look similar. They're not. Maximizing EV across a session is a forward-looking goal. It's about the next decision and the one after that, and the aggregate of all the decisions you'll make from this point forward. The chips you've already lost don't factor into it except insofar as they affect your remaining stack, and therefore the leverage available in future hands. Recovering the loss is a backward-looking goal. It's oriented toward a previous state. The stack you had before. The session that was going okay. The version of tonight that existed before things went wrong. Every decision gets evaluated not just on its own merits, but on its contribution to returning to that prior state. And this evaluation creates distortions that compound across every hand you play while you're in it. Here's the specific distortion. When the goal is recovering the loss, your brain mentally narrows the range of acceptable outcomes for each hand. A win that doesn't move you meaningfully toward recovery feels thin. A fold feels like standing still, which feels like falling behind the recovery goal, which registers emotionally as a loss even when it's the correct play. And a call, even a questionable call, even a call you'd fold in a heartbeat if the session were neutral, carries the possibility of contributing to recovery, which makes it feel not just acceptable, but necessary. This is why the urge to call when stuck feels logical. It is logical. Within the internal framework of recovering the loss, calling is often the action with the highest probability of moving the number in the right direction. The framework is wrong. The logic within it is functional. Fixing the behavior requires fixing the framework, not just applying more willpower to resist it. There's a specific phenomenon in behavioral psychology called the reference point effect, and it operates at poker tables with a precision that would be fascinating if it weren't so expensive. The reference point is the number your brain has decided represents neutral, not zero, neutral. The starting stack. The stack you had before the bad run began, the number that, if you could return to it, would allow the session to be filed under break even rather than loss. That number isn't neutral in any financial sense. You're not actually owed that stack. The chips that moved to other people moved through hands where the math was what it was, but your brain treats it as the reference point anyway, and everything that happens in the session gets evaluated against it. Above the reference point, you're winning. Below it, you're losing. And losing feels like a debt that has been incurred and needs to be repaid. The debt framing is what drives chasing behavior. Debts feel obligatory. You don't think of a session loss as the math ran badly for a few hours. You think of it as something owed, something that has been taken, something that has to be returned before you can close the ledger on tonight. And the only way to return it is to keep playing and accumulate the wins that move the number back toward the reference point. What the reference point effect specifically does to individual decisions is raise the value of any action that could move the number, regardless of whether that action is correct by any other measure. A call that has a 20% chance of winning a large pot and moving you back toward neutral feels more attractive than its expected value justifies, because it has a 20% chance of providing the emotional relief of debt repayment. A fold that is clearly correct strategically but doesn't move the number at all feels worse than it should, because it leaves the debt intact. You're not making poker decisions anymore. You're making debt management decisions. And debt management at a poker table has a specific and predictable outcome. You trade correct expected value decisions for emotional relief decisions, and the emotional relief decisions tend to be more expensive than the ones they replace. Let's talk about what's happening at the neurological level when you're stuck, because understanding the mechanism is part of breaking the grip it has on your behavior. Loss aversion, the well-established finding that losses feel roughly twice as painful as equivalent gains feel good, isn't just a preference, it's a physiological response. When you experience a sustained loss during a session, your brain activates stress responses related to the same pathways activated by physical threat. The session being down isn't just a financial abstraction. At the neurological level, it's registering as something wrong, something threatening, something that needs to be resolved. This activation doesn't clear when you take a break. It doesn't clear when you breathe and remind yourself its variance. It stays until one of two things happens. Either the loss gets recovered, which satisfies the threat response by eliminating what triggered it, or enough time and cognitive distance accumulates that the response gradually subsides on its own. The problem is you're still at the table. The chips are still in front of you. The hands are still coming. There's no cognitive distance because the source of the stress hasn't been removed. You're sitting next to it, and the next hand is another opportunity for the number to move in either direction. The threat response stays active. And under an active threat response, decision-making shifts in a consistent direction toward actions that have the highest probability of eliminating the threat, regardless of their longer-run expected value. This is the neuroscience of chasing, not a moral failure, not a discipline problem. A brain doing exactly what it evolved to do, responding to a threat by prioritizing immediate resolution over longer-term optimization. In the environments where this response evolved, immediate resolution was usually the correct priority. At a poker table, it is systematically catastrophic. Knowing this doesn't make the response disappear, but it changes the relationship you have with it. When you feel the pull toward the call that doesn't quite make sense, the call justified by the number moving rather than the hand strength, you can recognize it as the threat response operating, not as your considered strategic judgment, as a physiological mechanism doing its job in the wrong context. That recognition is the gap between the player who chases and the player who doesn't. Folding when you're stuck feels different than folding when you're winning or neutral. Substantially different. Different enough that many players who fold correctly in normal conditions start making systematic folding errors. Both overfolding in spots where they're giving up too soon and underfolding in spots where the call is clearly wrong. When the session goes badly, the reason is that the fold has acquired a meaning it doesn't carry in neutral conditions. When you're neutral, a fold is a decision. You assess the hand, the range, the pot odds, and the fold was correct. Clean. It cost you the possibility of winning this pot and nothing else. When you're stuck, a fold is a verdict. It says, this hand is over, and you didn't get anything back. The number hasn't moved. The debt is the same size it was before this hand started. And you have to wait for the next hand to try again, which means more time being stuck. More time in the uncomfortable state you're trying to escape. This is what's meant by folding feeling like losing twice. The first loss is the chips already gone. The second loss is the possibility of recovery in this hand being permanently closed off. The fold doesn't just end the hand. It ends the story of this hand. And the story ends without resolution. The call doesn't feel this way. The call keeps the story open. There's still a river to come. Still a showdown. Still the possibility that this hand ends with chips moving in the right direction. The call trades the certainty of a small, clean decision for the uncertainty of an outcome that might go well. And under a threat response, uncertainty that might resolve favorably is more attractive than certainty that resolves to nothing. This is the emotional illusion of the call. It doesn't feel like a bad decision. It feels like the only decision that maintains the possibility of recovery. And maintaining the possibility of recovery feels, when you're stuck, not just emotionally attractive, but genuinely necessary. You'd be abandoning something if you folded. The fold doesn't abandon anything. It releases a hand that was going to cost more than the pot was worth. But the emotional reality of being stuck has no interest in that analysis. Here's what fold psychology actually means, and why most players who understand the concept in theory still can't execute it consistently in practice. Fold psychology isn't about folding more. It's about folding correctly, meaning folding when the hand should be folded for strategic reasons, independent of what the session result is or what folding would mean for the number. The same fold that's correct when you're up 300 is correct when you're down 300. The mathematics of the decision don't change because your reference point changed. The problem is that when you're stuck, you're not evaluating folds against the mathematics. You're evaluating them against the emotional cost of what the fold represents. And the emotional cost scales with how stuck you are. The deeper the deficit, the more expensive each fold feels, because each fold is another opportunity foregone, another hand that didn't help, another increment of time spent being stuck. This creates a pattern that destroys sessions more completely than any individual bad beat. Because when folding feels prohibitively expensive, you start calling in spots you should fold. And the calls that happen when you should fold are not random. They cluster in specific spot types where the rationalization is easiest to construct. River calls with second pair when the bet screams strength, continuing in 3-bet pots with hands that need perfect runouts to win, defending preflop with holdings that would be obvious folds in a neutral session. These calls don't each cost an enormous amount individually. They cost an amount, and they happen repeatedly across multiple hands throughout the period when you're stuck, creating a steady drain that compounds on top of the deficit you were already trying to recover. The session doesn't end badly in one hand. It ends badly across 20 hands where the decision-making was calibrated to emotional need rather than strategic reality. You look back later, and the individual mistakes are each defensible enough that you can almost let yourself believe they were reasonable. The aggregate is not reasonable. The aggregate is a financial record of a brain trying to escape a feeling. Let me walk you through what session destruction looks like in real time, because the abstract version doesn't capture how normal each step feels while it's happening. You're down a buy-in. The loss came from 2 hands that were both reasonable. You got in ahead twice and lost both. The session isn't your fault in any meaningful sense. But you're still down, and the reference point is there, and the recovery goal is running. You get involved in a hand with top pair, weak kicker. Opponent leads the turn for a large size. In a neutral session, this is a fold. The sizing and the action don't suggest the opponent is bluffing at a frequency that justifies calling. But you call, because top pair feels like a hand that should win. Because folding top pair when you're already stuck feels like the session is happening to you rather than you participating in it. There's a version of this hand where you're ahead, and the pot recovers some of what you've lost. You lose the turn call. Now you're down a buy-in and a large turn bet. The next hand comes and you're looking at a speculative hand in a position where the implied odds don't quite justify continuing. But the recovery math says you need a big pot to get back, and speculative hands are how you build big pots. You continue. This hand goes bad on the flop. Now you're down significantly more than a buy-in. The third hand is where it usually goes terminal. You pick up a hand that's actually decent, not great but real. And you get it in a spot where the committed feeling is driving the action more than the strategic analysis is. Maybe it's a 3-bet jam on the turn with what started as a solid hand, but that the board has weakened more than you're acknowledging. Maybe it's a river shove with middle set on a board where the action has screamed that the villain has the nut straight. The hand is real enough that you can construct the call as reasonable. The call is not reasonable. This is what chasing looks like, not a single catastrophic decision. A sequence of individually defensible decisions that collectively represent your strategic judgment being systematically overridden by the recovery goal, hand by hand, and by decision, until the session ends at a loss substantially larger than the one that started the chase. The most expensive thing about chasing losses isn't any individual call. It's what the pattern teaches the rest of your game over time. When you get away with a chase, when the hero call works, when the speculative hand connects and you ship the pot, the lesson your brain records is not that you got lucky. The lesson it records is, staying in when you're stuck gets results. The reinforcement is real, the lesson is wrong, and it compounds. Players who chase regularly develop what amounts to a survival bias in their memory of their own play. The successful chases get remembered with clarity. That was the hand where I fought back, where I refused to accept the loss, where staying aggressive paid off. The failed chases are processed as variance. He happened to have it. The river was unlucky. The call was reasonable even if it didn't work out. The memory ends up with an inflated record of successful chasing and a discounted record of failed chasing, which makes the next decision to chase feel more justified than it should, which makes the threshold for staying in marginal spots when stuck progressively lower over time, which means the behavior compounds. The behavioral compounding is what turns a $200 loss into a $600 loss, is what turns a rough month into a rough quarter. Not one session where the emotional system overrode the strategic system. A pattern of sessions where it happened, where it worked sometimes, where the memory weighted the wins and discounted the losses, and where each subsequent session began with a slightly more permissive stance toward the actions that chasing requires. This is the hidden cost, not tonight's session. The drift in your game over months that you can feel but can't quite locate in any specific hand. The graph that trends slightly worse than your understanding of the game should produce. The sense that something is off that doesn't resolve no matter how much you study or how carefully you review. If this is hitting something real for you, if you're recognizing a version of this pattern in your own sessions, take a second before we get to the practical framework and do something simple. Like the video. I want to be honest about why it matters. This channel is built around content that takes the mental game seriously, not as a supplement to strategy content, but as the core of what determines whether strategy knowledge actually converts into results. Getting that content to the players who need it requires navigating the same algorithm that determines visibility for everything on this platform. That algorithm responds to engagement, likes, watch time, comments, shares. Without those signals, a video like this one reaches the people who already subscribe and very few beyond that. So if the content is genuinely useful, if understanding the reference point effect or the emotional logic of chasing gives you something you can actually use in your next session, that's worth 2 seconds and a click. It's the most direct way to tell the algorithm that this kind of serious psychological analysis is something the audience values. Share it with someone who's been having a rough stretch at the table, not as commentary on their play, as something that might help them understand what's actually happening when sessions go wrong in ways that don't feel like strategic failures. Subscribe if you want to stay in this conversation. The channel grows when players who think carefully about the game engage with it consistently. That's the audience this is built for. Here's the protocol. 3 steps. Simple enough to remember mid-session when the threat response is active and your capacity for elaborate frameworks is limited. Step 1. The reference point reset. When you notice your decision-making is being affected by where the session stands, when you catch yourself calculating how a hand could move the number rather than whether the hand is correct to play, stop and ask one question. If this session started right now with this exact stack, would I play this hand? That question strips the reference point out of the decision. It forces evaluation against what's actually present rather than what was present before. If the honest answer is no, if you wouldn't play the hand fresh, the hand is being evaluated against the deficit rather than against itself. Step 2. The cost accounting correction. When a fold feels prohibitively expensive because of the session result, do the math explicitly. What does the fold cost you? The answer is always the same: the chips you've put in to this point and the possibility of winning this specific pot. That's the full cost. It doesn't include the session deficit. It doesn't include the recovery goal. It doesn't include the emotional cost of the loss remaining what it is. If you're evaluating the fold as costing you the session deficit plus the current pot, the accounting is wrong. The session deficit is a sunk cost. It exists regardless of what you do in this hand. Step 3. The timeline extension. When the recovery goal is driving your decisions, it's because your brain has decided that tonight is when the recovery needs to happen. Extend the timeline. The recovery doesn't happen tonight. It happens across hundreds of future sessions if you make correct decisions consistently. Tonight's session is one data point in a very long series. If you play tonight correctly, meaning fold what should be folded, call what should be called, make the highest EV decision available regardless of session result, you've had a good session regardless of what the number says. If you chase tonight and recover the deficit, you've had a lucky session. Those are different things, and the difference compounds over time in one direction or the other. 3 steps. Reference point reset, cost accounting correction, timeline extension. Apply them in sequence in any spot where the session result is visibly influencing the decision. They don't make the threat response disappear. They give you enough space from it to make a decision from a different place. Here's the last thing. Chasing losses isn't about cards. You already know that. The hands you play when you're stuck aren't stronger than the hands you play when you're ahead. The boards aren't more favorable. The variance doesn't reverse because you need it to. What chasing is actually about is a refusal to accept a loss while you still have the ability to feel like you're fighting it, not the ability to change the session result. You don't have that ability. Not really. Not in any way that's consistent with playing correct poker. But the ability to change the feeling, to convert the ambient discomfort of being stuck into action, to feel like you're participating in your own recovery rather than sitting passively with a number that's wrong. The problem is that participation costs money. Every hand you play in a state of recovery-oriented decision-making is a hand where the strategic system has been partially overridden by the emotional system, and the emotional system makes worse poker decisions than the strategic system does. The action feels like agency. The outcome, accumulated across sessions, is a systematic transfer of money from your stack to people who stayed in their strategic system while you left yours. The fold that saves your session. The fold that ends the chase before it accelerates. The fold that keeps the loss at a number you can recover from across future sessions, rather than a number that requires explaining. That fold is almost never about cards. The fold that saves your session is rarely about cards. It's about who you are when you're losing.